Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Revolutionary War Rarities, the podcast from the Sons of the American Revolution. Today is episode 2 in a 3-part series entitled West Florida. This series is endorsed by the Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana 250th Commissions, and we are proud to have that endorsement. In this series, you will learn about the 14th colony of West Florida and the role it played in the American Revolution. In addition, you can scan the QR code on the screen and gain access to the lesson plans on West Florida created by the American Village. We welcome you to Revolutionary War Rarities and the stories of West Florida, the 14th colony. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Revolutionary War Rarities, the podcast from the Sons of the American Revolution. My name is Jim Griffith, and today we are going to cover episode 2 of the series on West Florida. And we have 2 very special guests with us. Our first guest is the one that we had in episode 1 named Mr. Mike Bunn. Mike, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
Mike is the author of 14th Colony, The Forgotten Story of the Gulf South here in America's Revolutionary Era. A great book. Once again, Mike, thank you for writing this. It's been a great resource for all of us. Additionally, we have Mr. Val Cross. Val is the Chief Education and Programs Officer, also the Chief Historian for the American Village, and he is also a member of the America's 250th Commission, also known as the Semiquincentennial Commission. So you are on the National Commission. We appreciate you being here with us, Val.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. It's good to be with you guys.
Well, we appreciate both of you being here. Now, on episode 1, we discussed what West Florida actually was. We discussed the boundaries, what life was like in West Florida. Today, we're going to jump into the actual war in West Florida. We're going to talk about the battles that occurred and how that evolved over time. So let's jump in. Mike, first question's for you. I know that the 14th colony was invited to attend the Second Continental Congress and opted out of going. That would make one believe that the 14th colony, and once again, for everyone's satisfaction, I'm referring to the 14th colony as West Florida. That's a debatable point, right? That was not an official 14th colony, I don't guess, but we're stating for the purpose of this podcast that West Florida is the 14th colony. Their lack of attendance at the Second Continental Congress would make you believe that they were a loyalist colony. Talk to us about that. Were they?
Well, the technical answer is this: yes, because they did not join the rebellion. The more complicated, truthful answer is that they would not have perceived themselves in that sort of light. They didn't view it in a black and white, we're for or against this. They lived, frankly, outside of the orbit of what we know as the 13 colonies that united in that coordinated effort to stage rebellion to overthrow British rule. Their world was slightly different. They were technically part of that colonial enterprise, but they had very little, almost no regular communication with any of those 13 colonies, the seaboard colonies. There was very little news between them and what was happening on the seaboard. They viewed themselves as a part of the British Empire, but entirely separated from these seaboard colonies, much as if you were a British colony that might have interactions with another British colony on another side of the globe. So when they heard about what was happening in the war and the lead up to it, they quite frankly viewed it as sort of a local concern that was somebody else's problem that didn't really register as a common cause where they were. Their situation was entirely different. Their needs were entirely different. They had just been established. They needed every bit of British support from the government they could get. They had an inordinate amount of their population was in the direct employment of the government, and they had no regular communication and trade going on with these seaboard colonies. So when they got bits and pieces of this information, they just thought it was a local conflict that would kind of play itself out, didn't see an urgent reason to become involved and endanger themselves for the benefit of a far-flung colony. They perceived themselves on the ragged edge of civilization, if you will. So that's the long technical answer of what was really going on. But the truth is they did not join. So it's appropriate to say they're a loyalist colony. Their feelings, their motivations, their loyalties were anything but they're clear cut, though.
Well, they ultimately got into the war, right? The 14th colony ultimately did join the war. So,
Well,
what
the
was
war
the
found them. The war found them is what I would characterize it at. It found them in two ways. It found them with Willing's raid, and then it found them with Spain's efforts to capture British territory in West Florida. So the war, although they tried their best to stay out of this, it ultimately found them in two different ways and had significant impact on the course of development of that colony.
Yeah, Mike, as I was reading your book, it seems like it was sort of a revolving door down there, right? They were looking at, is it France, Spain, Britain, who's in control at what time? That had to have been difficult for them, I would think.
Well, it was definitely a unique experience because you've got these competing European powers which had laid claim to the area. If you look at what the geography of the colony of West Florida, it involves two areas which had been for a long time under two different colonial regimes, France and Spain. And now Britain is inserting themselves in the entirety of the area. So from the very beginning, it's a confused situation. It was not one in which you had these diehard loyalties that were at stake. It was one that they were more concerned in their day-to-day life. How do we get on? How do we manage? We're on the ragged edge, as I said, of a colonial enterprise. They saw their concerns much more day to day, immediate, local than anything that would connect them with the larger interest of an empire at that moment. And part of that reason is they had been so recently added to this British Empire. So it's a complex situation to understand. But I always boil it down to simply say they perceived what was going on as somebody else's problem. And it really, how is that going to improve their day to day situation, help them earn a living, help them begin to negotiate the path towards creating a prosperous colony? None of that, what was going on, seemed like that was going to be benefited by jumping and putting themselves in the middle of another local concern 1,000 miles away.
So take us through the battles. Let's start. Talk to us about where the first battle was. Just take us through the war in the 14th colony.
Well, the first problem that manifested itself as a military emergency in the colony was actually Willing's raid, which occurred in 1778, in the spring of 1778. So that was a raid by an American force that had gone down to West Florida on the Mississippi River, allegedly to help open up routes of communication between the Spanish colony of Louisiana, which very much was opposed to Britain, and so they could support the American war effort, and to make sure that West Florida stayed out of the war. The truth was, neither neither of those things were very imminent that were going to be determined by that raid. Louisiana was already supporting the war effort, the American war effort. Oliver Pollock was sending a lot of money and supplies and ammunition to George Washington's army, and West Florida had no intention of joining the war effort at that time. So what happens? It devolved into this small raid where Willing, who was in command of it, basically captured a lot of plunder, goes down to New Orleans, which is in Spanish territory, and just assumed he could sell all of it and he could make himself and his followers rich. And that's sort of what happened. They eventually captured Willing, the British did, and Spain kind of grew tired of being put in the middle of all this. But the bigger thing that happened for the course of the war is it revealed that Spain, which was in control of New Orleans, and the British in control of the West Florida, they had enjoyed this sort of unofficial truce for years prior to that, where they had traded semi illegally and done other things where they were actually getting along. And they realized that policy was going to change, that Spain was indeed going to follow the wishes of its home government back in Europe. And at that moment, it was considering joining the war. And the way they joined the war was to officially declare war on Great Britain. They did not officially endorse American independence. But as always, I say, the effect was the same. Once Spain declared war on Great Britain, it required resources of the British that otherwise would have been sent to fight the Continental Army. So you've got suddenly you're forcing Britain to be on a two-front war. And so what happened next was Spain, under Galvez's leadership in the colony of Louisiana, devised a series of campaigns that are going to systematically take control of the entirety of West Florida. He's going to start in the summer of 1778 with a campaign that goes up to the border with West Florida. He's going to capture Fort Butte. He's going to capture Baton Rouge after a short siege in September of 1778. Going to force the surrender of Natchez in that. He's going to go back and regroup and then launch a second campaign that's going to capture Mobile. There's going to be a small fight on the eastern shore of Mobile Bay a few months after that. And then he's ultimately going to devise a third campaign, the final campaign, which is going to go capture the capital of West Florida, Pensacola, which is a long siege. So that's sort of a nutshell overview of what's going to happen as we get into the actual fighting in West Florida.
If I recall correctly, I believe the capture of Natchez occurred without firing a single shot. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah, they had captured Baton Rouge. The Spanish had after a siege had used a little bit of subterfuge to confuse the British as to where the main assault would come, and they were surprised when the main assault came from the direction it did. So they quickly forced a surrender, and in the terms ending that altercation there, the Spaniards, who had the complete upper hand, forced the commander at Baton Rouge to throw in the surrender of the fort at Natchez, which was 100 miles upriver. No shots were fired, but he was forced to put it into the terms demanding the surrender. And so that sort of culminated this first wave, what some people refer to as the March of Galvez. That's late summer, August into September 1779 campaign that basically took every British defensible point, captured it, rendered it useless, captured hundreds of soldiers in the process. That's that first campaign. And it was all focused on the western defenses of the colony that the British had. Every one of them fell. So this first wave, this first campaign was just entirely lopsided. Spain captured everything Britain had on its western reaches of the colony.
And Mike, quick comment here and question for you. When Galvez got to Pensacola, that whole idea of the "I alone" comment that he made, can you talk a little bit about that? I think it's kind of amazing what he did there.
Yeah, that if you're familiar with Galvez's story at all, you probably heard the phrase "I alone." There's even a book called Yo Solo about him, I alone. What that's the backstory is that when he led the largest force he had assembled to as a combined Army and Navy force to Pensacola to lay siege to the place, capture it. He arrived there and had his army and had a small fleet under his direct command, 3 ships that were from the colony of Louisiana. But he was being joined and assisted by a official fleet of Spain under a naval commander. Galvez assumed he was in overall command of the entire expedition, and so he got to the mouth of Pensacola Bay and said, "There they are. Let's go in. Let's go ahead and take care of business right now." And the commander of the Spanish fleet was standing aside looking at this, and he basically said, "I don't know what guns they've got in this bay. I don't know the path in. I don't know, is there a shallow spot that's going to ground my boats? I'm not about to just rashly charge in and risk my fleet. We're going to have to stop and surveil this situation before we go in." So Galvez sort of hastily decided, that's not the way. If you won't do it, I alone will take the 3 ships I command and I'll go into the bay. And that's what he did. And he incurred a lot of British fire, but at the end of it, had no serious damages. Had gotten his 3 gunboats into the middle of the bay. Spanish soldiers are watching this, cheering him on. The British are watching this, realizing they don't have defenses against a fleet entering their bay, and he sort of shamed the commander of that naval fleet to then follow him in and begin the formal siege of the place. So he was so recognized for this bold action of he alone taking his small little mosquito fleet into the bay, that he actually persuaded the Spanish government to add a new tile on his official family coat of arms, and came from a very prominent family. But they added a tile on there that literally is a depiction of a single man on a boat, a gunboat, with a banner flying above it that says "Yo Solo." So that became one of his claims to fame, and one that we still recognize him by today. But that's the backstory to that phrase.
So the Revolutionary War never reached Vicksburg, right? That was the northernmost part, at least along the American Revolution of West Florida, where the Yazoo, if I recall correctly, where the Yazoo River comes into the Mississippi. Uh, we end up going down through Natchez, Baton Rouge. We come out the Mississippi River and they go across towards Mobile. There's a lot of islands out there across the coast of Mississippi, the Gulf Islands National Seashore, which goes all the way, on into Florida as well. Did those islands play any role at all during the American Revolution?
Not a significant one, because there were no military forces out there. They did sort of frame the routes that the Spanish would approach by, help them understand the coastline, and so there's some surveillance sort of roles that those play. But basically, the Spanish fleet came from New Orleans, and when they're going to go attack Mobile, they go directly to Mobile. Um, After this first campaign that captured all the forces, this British forces on the Mississippi River, when I do presentations on this, I always try to stop and explain between Natchez and Baton Rouge and Mobile. Of course, you know what we have now. You've got a little bit of southeastern Louisiana, and you got the Mississippi Gulf Coast, which has a long history. But at this time, really no sizable settlements are in that coastal area, and there's no major military fortifications in that area that are key strategic British positions. So basically, once Galvez had captured the Mississippi, the next obvious point, if he wanted to gain control of the colony, was Mobile. So you kind of skip over it. But once you capture Mobile, you in effect have captured everything to the west of it. So that was the strategy, and that's why you end up with campaigns on the Mississippi, and then all of a sudden you're at Mobile Bay. That was the reason behind that.
Okay. All right. Very good. Now, we're showing on the screen right now the tight entryway into Pensacola Bay. It is very tight. It is what, less than a mile across there? And I understand, were there forts on both sides of that?
They had there were fortifications. I would not call what they had a formal fort like they had once you get into the interior of the bay. You had some redoubts and some artillery positions. And when Spain arrived, they actually surprised some of the guys that were on that point there as you enter, and quickly took over that, put their own guns there. So the real uh, formal traditional defenses are going to be further into the bay. So they could get into the bay, but they weren't sure how close they could get to the city itself. So what Galvez did is, once he got in there, they quickly discovered the British forces there at what is now Fort Barrancas, and now downtown Pensacola. They just didn't have the wherewithal to really do serious damage to those boats at that distance. And so that influences where he's going to land and how he's going to formally begin this siege. But the British didn't have anything really strong to deter him from entering there. They had some smaller artillery positions.
So we're getting towards the end of this episode. Talk to us about the siege, the taking of Pensacola. How long was the siege in Pensacola, and what did that look like?
Well, it began in March 9th, 1781. It's going to go on through May, where the official surrender of the city is May 10th, 1781. So it's what, 3 months long siege. It's a long, complicated affair. It involved fighting almost daily. And Pensacola has multiple fortifications that it's not one single fort. So as the Spanish army, and it's eventually going to be joined by a French fleet, and already had a Spanish fleet, as they're in the bay and they're sort of tightening the noose on this place, it involves fighting that from the ships, involves fighting of troops. The British have their army and their fortifications. They also have, at least the beginning of the siege, some allied Indian warriors. And you've got these small skirmishes and constant fighting there's taking place as the Spanish are basically getting progressively closer. They establish a place where they could sort of a beachhead for them to launch formal assaults on these fortifications that's a little bit closer to them. So it's a lot of sort of daily, slow, methodical moving closer to the British positions where they could launch their formal assault. Which, when it finally came, those larger formal assaults finally came, it quickly reduced the British position. But the siege just involves a slow, steady approach, being careful to not expose themselves to the worst of the British fire. They did have a lot of artillery, but the Spaniards were taking a careful route, erecting earthworks, being careful in their approach, and it just took a long time. It's a long, complicated siege. Galvez himself was injured during this thing. A lot of folks were injured and died on the way to it, but the final attacks on these forts don't occur until early May of 1781.
Very good. Okay, Mike, Val, thank you so much for joining us for this particular episode, episode 2. So now we've talked about what West Florida was. We've talked about the battles and the war in West Florida. The next step is we're going to talk about really the impact on West Florida, what that looked like after the war was over with. I think it's interesting when you look at the impact. A lot of times people will think, yeah, there were battles that occurred in Pensacola and Mobile and Natchez and Baton Rouge, but it had very little to do with the original 13 colonies simply because of the geological diversity. It was that far away. But in fact, history has a way of repeating itself, doesn't it? One could look at the challenges of the British logistics and getting people where they needed to get them, and they were running short on supplies. And you could very easily compare that to World War II and some of the challenges that Germany opened up when they opened up another front in the war. They just simply were spread too thin. So history has a way of repeating itself, and that's in fact why I love history so much, because you can certainly learn from the past and almost predict the future. So guys, thank you so much for being here for this episode. I hope everyone will join us again for the final episode of West Florida, where we talk about the impact of the revolution on West Florida. In the meantime, if you haven't seen this book by Mike Bunn, 14th Colony, The Forgotten Story of the Gulf South During America's Revolutionary Era, it's a great read. It will go into a lot more detail than we're able to cover in a 15 to 20 minute podcast. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My friends, we hope that you'll join us again in 2 weeks for another episode of Revolutionary War Rarities. This has been a production of the National Society, Sons of the American Revolution, www.sar.org.
In 1776, a spark ignited. Dreamers and believers so united. Through trials and fire, we found our way. Now 250 years, we proudly say, with fields of amber and mountains that rise, we stand as one beneath these vast skies, from sea to shining sea, through struggle and grace. Together we create our own embrace. So raise your voice and let it ring. Celebrate this day, let freedom sing. 250 strong, hearts ablaze. Together